The official title of the Storylines project for the ARC funders was This Side of the Frontier, Indigenous Art from the Settled Regions of Australia. It was an ARC Discovery Grant project that investigated the landscape of Aboriginal art practice from below the Rowley line, and I'm going to show you what the Rowley line is. The Rowley line was created by Professor Charles Rowley, professor and author, and at one time chairman of the now defunct Aboriginal Land Fund Commission. He died in the mid-1980s. What he did is he drew this line across Australia, and above the Rowley line is all the colonial remote area, and below is the settled regions, as he called them. That's been a problem for Aboriginal people ever since he drew that line. Those above it were the real Aborigines, as we would call them now, and below it, you know, all the cranky blacks, basically. And we know with art history that the documentation of Aboriginal art has definitely happened above the Rowley line. Below the Rowley line, we've hardly heard of anything except for the big art stars like Destiny Deacon, Vernon Arkey, Richard Bell, Gordon Hookey, Fiona Foley, Brooke Andrew, those sorts of people, those art school trained people. So my job was to find out what's out there, who's out there, and let's see what the findings are. And I'm going to talk tonight about how I did it, some of the problems I had, and then a brief overview of our findings. So after 3 years of research, travel and writing for the Storylines project, I have learnt a trick or two on how to access artists and how to navigate the minefield that is community cultural development and Aboriginal fine art, community arts and regional arts. Surprisingly, some organisations were very resistant in allowing me to access their collections, their databases and their contacts. Some Aboriginal arts and heritage organisations proved incredibly protective of their collections and databases of artists' names and resisted my many attempts to extract information about their collections and artists. These reasons could be many. Suspicion on yet another researcher going through their files with her grubby little fingers, and based on possible bad experiences of the past, could lead to this overprotective behaviour. They could also have not ever had such a request as mine before and are again suspicious. Or possibly they may not want to admit to bad record keeping in the first place on their behalf and feel a bit ashamed. And I think in some instances I was suspicious of that. I also had some issues with state and national regional arts organisations. They too were less than helpful. No amount of correspondence to the workers within these organisations allowed me access to their contacts and regional networks of workers. Although Aboriginal organisations that were practice-based arts organisations were incredibly helpful and incredibly keen to have the artists on their books represented and provided no end of information. And here I am thinking of Bulang Nungamay in Gerringong, Kadogo Arts in Fremantle, East Gippsland Aboriginal Arts Organisation in obviously East Gippsland region of Victoria, and Ceduna Aboriginal Arts Centre in South Australia. All of these centres provided me access to files, artists and any extra information I required, and therefore all of their artists on their books have their biographies published on the DAO. Contacting artists individually has been my most successful method to date. Not that I contacted 600 artists individually, although I did contact a lot. Knowing one person in a region can lead me or lead you to the next, who will lead you to the next, and so on. Also, working with organisations that are not strictly arts-based has proven effective, such as the Koori Business Network of Victoria, who published the book Tribal Expressions with the names and contact information on as many Victorian artists and arts organisations as they could find. It's a brilliant resource. This organisation also published an online publication called Retail Trade, which is a listing of every Victorian Aboriginal retailer, and some of these are art centres or have an arts component. Also, the federal government in 2006 published the Visual Arts and Craft Resource Directory, which proved helpful. Some of the interesting things I learnt in my travels around Aboriginal Australia included when we were in Tasmania, at one workshop we gave in Launceston, we showed the biography of Dulcie Greenough. There she is with her shell working, or shell stringing as they call it in Tassie. We showed them the biography we wrote on Dulcie, which we had written before we went to Tasmania, because Dulcie's quite famous in certain art worlds. Her bio read as Greenough this and Greenough that, but this at that workshop was perceived as the height of rudeness. It was explained to us that as Dulcie was a highly regarded elder and artist, that she should be written as Auntie Dulcie this and Auntie Dulcie that, regardless of how Western art history has been written. And so despite the wrath of academic art historians who may read this biography, it was immediately agreed that the wording of Dulcie's bio be changed to reflect that of the way she is regarded and discussed in Aboriginal art circles of Tasmania. Also in Tasmania, we learnt that the word auntie, I would spell it A-U-N-T-Y, is spelled A-U-N-T-I-E, and if I got it wrong, woe betide me. We also learnt that the proper names for people and places in Tasmania, a lot of people, Aboriginal people in Tasmania, don't capitalise the letter, but the first letter of each proper name. And I'll just show you a bio, not written by me, but written by a Tasmanian writer, about a woman known officially as Bernice Condi, but also known as Mercarton. And you can see Mercarton is a Palawa woman. So the M and the P are not capitalised. It's a very, very Tasmanian thing. And there was no way I could not publish it as such. And I know that for people who are researching and come across it, they're going to be incredibly confused. But maybe we can have parts on the new dictionary where we can say why it is the way it is. These may be small and seemingly insignificant factors, but I believe that they are important markers of identity, an identity that is attempting to distinguish itself from the perceived dominant Aboriginal identity of the New South Wales Aboriginal or Koori. Some of the issues that I've had in creating this new history under this set structure that is the DAO have been varied and many. If an individual artist could not be contacted or didn't ring me back or email me back or write to me, and I had information about them, I would create what is known as a stub and provide them with a place marker in art history. This stub, at the bottom of each stub, it's an incomplete biography, and at the bottom of each stub I ask for more information or another writer to come in and complete the biography. And this has actually happened with one young girl who's a COFA graduate, Jessica Burke. But she came across her own stub on the DAO and rewrote her own biography herself and did it in the language of the DAO and under the DAO guidelines. I choose not to, even though I've got a lot of information about some artists, if I haven't been able to contact them, I choose not to call it a complete bio. And considering the history of ethnography, scientific exploration and anthropology that has taken place in this country over the last 200 years, I felt that this is very important to try and contact the individual artists and have their approval about what I have written about them. In many cases, an artist would request certain information about them be excluded from their biography. For example, one particularly highly regarded elderly artist had given up creating work because of the sudden deaths of his two middle-aged children. This is not documented as such in his biography. It doesn't say the reason why he's finished working, it just says he stopped working. Although it is relevant to him stopping his practice, he asked that this not be documented either in the biography or the metadata. Perhaps though, when he too passes on, I'll contact the next of kin and ask if I can reflect more accurately why he stopped working. But in the meantime, that person's not, there is no information about why he stopped. And it's just a respect thing that you do for living people, I suppose. And I don't think that the stuff I do is peculiar to Aboriginal people. I think it's just something we should adopt more broadly. There was another artist, Phyllis Stewart. In the metadata, there's a section that says, you know, language group if you're Aboriginal, and you can put in your language group. And Phyllis, I'll just show you a photo of Phyllis because she's gorgeous. Phyllis, she did not want me to mention her language group name. A less sensitive person would probably question this, and indeed a less sensitive person has. But one has to think of her answer in the historical context on why she doesn't want her language group published. She may have been removed from her family, her family may have been displaced, or any other of the myriad of issues that affect Aboriginal people that have led to them not having proof of who they are, and therefore by extension where they are from, which is the core foundation for identifying your place within Aboriginal society. Another issue that came up was when we went to Tasmania. Julie Goff, the well-known artist down there, insisted that her biography not be the first Tasmanian biography, Aboriginal biography, published online, even though hers was one of the first ones I wrote. She has insisted that the elder Tasmanian artists around her have an online presence before her, even though she is probably one of Tasmania's most successful internationally renowned artists. This has not been an issue with any other state, and again, it's been a Tasmanian-only quirk. Many of the artists I've discovered, particularly in New South Wales, are now rejecting any attempt to be included in an Aboriginal-only art directory, but will gladly spend time for an entry onto the DAO. This, I feel, is a massive shift in the Australian art paradigm. I've also had some problems in the early days with the DAO itself and how the DAO structure didn't really fit with the kind of things I'll be asking Aboriginal people. For example, in the media category of the DAO, you will notice if you do an advanced search, there's all these different forms that you can choose from. We found then, when we began, that was incredibly Eurocentric. Before I began working on storylines, there was no entry field for carving or weaving or shell working. It was viewed that all these could be placed under the category of other, which is right down the bottom. But you can imagine the political ramifications of this if I was unsuccessful in getting these entries listed as requested. I did have a bit of a fight on my hands with this issue and relented at shell working not being added. Though I have found that with many of the Tasmanian artists who primarily work with bull kelp from the ocean are also being placed under other in the media category. It seems that media used from the oceans has no place of its own on the DAO as it now stands. And we have built a critical mass, I believe, of shell workers, shell stringers, and people who use natural media from the ocean to perhaps invent a new media term. Another problem that we had was related people. As the DAO now stands, family members, there is no way where to include great aunties or great uncles or great grandparents, and this is problematic for my research, as many people have a strong family and sometimes published documentation of their ancestors, like they have a strong oral stories and sometimes published documentation. For instance, the shell worker Esme Timbry has artistic lineage dating back to the very early last century with her great-grandmother, Queen Emma Timbry, who was documented in the Australian Aborigines Advocate as showing her shell-worked objects in London in 1910. Queen Emma, on Esme's biography, is noted as other, with a note to who she actually is. A similar entry has happened with the uncle and aunt of Fiona Foley, who was greatly influenced by their published book, The Legend of the Moonee Jarl, yet they too are now listed as other. After 3 years of investigation, travel and correspondence, we have produced a website, storylines.org.au, that documents our findings. And with all the knowledge we have been given and the stories we have been allowed to share, I'm positive that we have only scratched the surface. The Storylines team of Laura Fisher, Vivian Johnson, who was like the chief investigator, and myself have spent the last 12 months analysing the collected data, and our findings are on this website. The full report will be coming soon, and but we have, on each category, we have narrowed it down a bit to have like the best of findings, but you can read the full report if you so choose to do. So this next part, our findings, is Vivian's writing based on my research. And our findings were that a complaint frequently voiced by some high-profile artists in our sample was that urban Indigenous artists generally, and themselves in particular, are ignored by sections of the Australian art world who tend to regard Aboriginal art as only that produced in remote community art centres. Storylines data did enable us to measure the success of Storylines artists by standard art world criteria, like inclusion into collections and art awards, and to map how factors such as formal art school training, gender and age correlate with such forms of recognition. Our findings indicated that however neglectful they may have been in the past of Indigenous art from this side of the Rowley line, the major public art and major private collections do now acknowledge these artists' existence in their acquisition policies, albeit replicating the mainstream art world's so-called star system. But the vast majority of artists documented in Storylines were working outside the paradigm of conceptual artwork that dominates the practice of these established urban-based Indigenous artists, and is often founded on high-level art school training and immersion within an urban art world. One of the most striking of Storylines' discoveries about Aboriginal art practice south of the Rowley line was the diversity of circumstances and forms of art making that challenge the dichotomy of remote versus urban, underpinning the way Indigenous art is perceived in the mainstream art world. Most Storylines artists' profiles were extremely localised and completely off the radar of city-based curators, galleries and art magazines, and could be described as remote from the Australian art world in a manner that tells a very different story to that usually evoked by that categorisation. Although Indigenous art from the settled regions is widely seen as emerging with the Koori Art 84 exhibition and the establishment of Bumali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative in Chippendale in the late 80s, many artists in our sample have been active for decades before these landmark events. Not just the high-profile pioneers and founding father figures like Ron Hurley, Trevor Nichols, Gordon Siren, Kevin Gilbert and Lynn Onus, but also many people, usually women, who worked from a very young age in a traditional media, weavers, shell workers, egg carvers, etc., not recognised until recently as art media. Esme Timbry claimed to have her first shell work making experience at the age of 7, and she's in her late 70s now. Many people working exclusively in such media were continuing a creative practice that went back well before the contemporary Indigenous art movement gained momentum. Many had been extremely poor for periods of their lives, and for them selling artwork had been, in a very unromantic sense, part of a hand-to-mouth existence. For many in the survey, men and women, becoming an artist had meant, if not substantial earnings and acclaim from their art making, then a significant qualitative improvement in their employment prospects, often in some area of the Indigenous arts industry. It appears the recent Senate report's recommendations that more Indigenous people be employed in the industry is already happening, especially for women. Art making was often grounded far more in family and community togetherness than individual professional development. In addition to providing subject matter, family members also provided many Storylines artists with their only art training. This is commonly the case with Aboriginal artists from remote communities north of the Rowley line, where art audience seem to find it acceptable because it's felt that rather than art school training, these artists have culture and tradition. Urban Aboriginal artists, however, are believed by these same audience not to have culture or tradition as such, only politics, and they can reach an acceptable place in the art world only when they work within the groove of conceptual political art, participating within the dialogues that underline particular art genres as a result of art school training. The maintenance and rejuvenation of pre-colonial traditions, as well as the transfer of skills between family members, took so many different forms in so many different contexts that the Storylines team can vouch for the need for a new nuanced understanding of the role of tradition in Aboriginal art created outside the Central Desert and Top End. The same can be said for how connection to country shaped artist practice. Language groups presented storylines with a unique difficulties in terms of compilation of statistical data. There were major spelling variations for almost every language name. It was the artists themselves who insisted vehemently, I might add, on the correctness of the variant they were supplying, pointing to the major significance of language groups as basis of Indigenous identity in the settled regions. In a number of cases, these artists were producing work that was derivative of or sought to emulate the dot-dot style of the Central Desert and painted images of native animals or landscapes decorated with dots. Such inclinations reflect the struggle faced by Indigenous Australians who do not come from remote communities in having their Aboriginal identity acknowledged by non-Indigenous society. For people whose family have lived under an oppressive social structure that compel them to feel ashamed about, conceal and or escape from their cultural identity, a shift towards embracing one's Aboriginality and learning to feel proud and strong as an Aboriginal person can understandably lead to such artist identifications. Unfortunately, it will also prevent these artists from ever being taken seriously within the mainstream art world as having their own artistic vision. However, Storylines also encountered numerous artists and artist groups who wanted nothing to do with the generalised, generic image of what Aboriginal art is, and were seeking to establish styles that reflected their own localised traditions, their own country, their own distinctive experiences. In some cases, an explicitly defiant stance can be discerned. In the East Gippsland Aboriginal Arts Corporation's 2008 publication, Not Just Dots, Aboriginal Art and Artists from East Gippsland in southeastern Victoria, Albert Mullett states that the environment is part of the heart. Art is a way of connecting to the environment. I never saw dots in the past, only in recent years. It is important that the traditional owners are supporting young people in the development of their artwork. We tell our artists they shouldn't do dots. It doesn't belong to this country. While all forms of art were being produced, derivative or original, have a therapeutic value that enriches artists' lives, being introduced to forms beyond painting, such as sculpture and printmaking, etc., etc. And given the opportunity to develop skills and receive some guidance, artists can reach beyond this and discover new ways of expressing themselves that can potentially become great art. Their stories resonate far beyond art history and are relevant to Australian cultural history in general. In many cases, they are illustrative of the experience of Indigenous Australians that have only recently come to be acknowledged and historicised as part of the country's past and character. In the DAO spirit of collaborative research, we hope that researchers who continue the work of Storylines beyond the life of the project will improve the comprehensiveness of the data on this group of artists and make possible both a more complete picture and monitoring of ongoing developments. The end.